Today we will listen to a thinking session I had with students last year where we engaged ideas around an argument I presented that suggested Afrofuturism is an ancient idea that expresses itself as an Africana freedom principle. It is an articulation of a constellation of deep Africana ideas and practices of what I called Africa's ancient future, a nod to Wayne Chandler's Ancient Future. Through historical and ancestral memories of magic, use of spiritual technologies, intentional philosophies of life, heretical temporality, creative nonlinear knowledge production, and a symbiotic connection with nature and the universe, Africa's ancient future is articulated through a freedom principle, which implies a constant struggle to delink one's collective self from now moments, reconciling past moments in order to create future moments that allow the full expression of one's humanity. To thoroughly understand the ideas that we were engaging during this session, we must understand Afrofuturism as dominantly expressed and studied as a contradiction and a product of distorted conceptualizations of time. A distortion that reinscribes racialized perspectives and perceptions of history and demonization of Africana advanced understandings of it. More frankly, a negating of it, a shaming of it, with the use of pejoratives such as CP time, or black folks are always late. What was of specific importance to our interrogation of the time concept was its arrested expression as a Western European construct. The temporal ticks used to mark the flow of human phenomenon and phenomena are mapped from distorted perceptions of a limited reality, perceptions that were born from a historical and ancestrally specific cultural worldview, then forced upon the world through enslavement, colonialism, imperialism, language, and religious violence. The idea of Afrofuturism as an arrested concept is found in the question which is often associated with its origins, as posed by Mark Deary. He asked, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its history imagine possible futures? Folk are more intentionally unpacking the interdependent categories of thought that inform such a question and its implications on the way the Africana world is understood, specifically the West's consistent imperial project of defining what Africana is and is not. Nevertheless, Afrofuturism and its relation to an arrested time concept limits the ability to understand Africana experiences, relegating them to temporal categories defined by the conceptualizations of a white Western imagination that are inherently limited in its ability to even conceptualize an Africa's ancient future. The reductionist approach to the vastness of Africa's philosophies of life, deep understandings of cosmology, complex systems of knowledge, the multiplicity in Africana understandings of what it means to be human are problematic to say the least. This brings us to Nnedi Okorafor, one thinker and writer who has presented an important intervention and one pillar of thought upon which I critically engage Afrofuturism. Okorafor writes, and I must quote in its totality, I am an African futurist and an African jujuist. African futurism is a subcategory of science fiction. African jujuism is a subcategory of fantasy that respectfully acknowledges the seamless blend of true existing African spiritualities and cosmologies with the imaginative. African futurism is similar to Afrofuturism in the way that blacks on the continent and in the black diaspora are all connected by blood, spirit, history, and future. The difference is that African futurism is specifically and more directly rooted in African culture, history, mythology, and point of view as it then branches into the black diaspora, and it does not privilege or center the West. African futurism is concerned with the visions of the future, is interested in technology, leaves the earth, skews optimistic, is centered on and predominantly written by people of African descent, black people, and is rooted first and foremost in Africa. It's less concerned with what could have been and more concerned with what is and can and will be. It acknowledges, grapples with, and carries what has been. Okorafor ends her intervention with this. African futurism does not have to extend beyond the continent of Africa, though it often does. Its default is non-Western. Its default center is African. This is distinctly different from Afrofuturism. This brings us back to what I intended to do with the young minds in this session of our semester course. which was to present ideas that culminate into an argument that pushes us to think about the ways we understand Africa and the concept of time in relation to the future as defined by a freedom principle. I wanted to present ideas that allows us to think critically about the past, present, and future in an attempt to push me and them to think about the uses of a radical imagination and creativity to envision African futures. To think beyond struggle while struggling, ultimately situating struggle in a long genealogy of resistance at all levels of human existence. Black radicalism's esoteric dimensions. This session, as with all sessions where I engage with thoughts and ideas, whether it's with students or in the community, was intentionally and deliberately unorthodox. We wanted to pull on events, people, and places that are not normally engaged in dominant discourses in the academy. Therefore, to clearly outline the argument I'm making, I do so now in order for you to follow the conversation you are about to hear, all while provoking and inviting you to think with me, think beyond me, think around me, think over me, think through me, but think nonetheless. The argument as presented then and today suggests that in order to understand Afrofuturism or African futures as an intellectual theoretical frame or lens through which to understand the place of Africa in a future is a very ancient idea. I argued that we must map its provocations at various moments to be extracted from the deep cultural fabric of Africana people, which is an interdependent relationship between the material and spiritual, a way of life, to its development as an epistemic frame through which we can see all Africana ways of knowing reassert itself on a global stage as the progenitor of all human knowledge. Communities, the people that inhabit the geographical spaces referred to as continental Africa, have always been acutely aware of the future. The cultural practices and current religious forms and functions are rooted in a deep African spiritual understanding and worldview. This is not a profound acknowledgement. However, the future, the concept of the unseen, a moment that is to come, is prevalent and vital to highlight. The relationship to land, the universe, and ancestors are centered around an understanding of the seamless interconnectedness of past, present, and future, and we have a duty and responsibility to maintain it in balance, which is and can be important to apply as a socio-political organizing principle. This is another point and program altogether, of course, but important to highlight nonetheless, especially if we situate this argument I'm making in discourses around socio-political and economic relations, which will then highlight the limits of rights discourse, which are currently rooted in individualist notions where duty and responsibility can be negated by the rule of law, which is birthed in the reconceptualization of the human as a justification and maintenance for private property. How do we know Africana peoples have always been acutely aware of the future to be a fact? Categories of thought related to time, reconceptualized through a European imposition of a specific worldview, operates to divide whatever it engages with. However, categories of thought that are embryonic to Africana ways of knowing are inherently dialectical, mathematical, and carry multiple meanings through and with what is considered unorthodox language patterns, all inherently connective, seeking to constantly reconcile continuities to nature, to community, to the universe. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descended communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, and Ghana, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Enjoy the program.
We segue into the way that I think about Afrofuturism, and I'm going to use African future as a concept for us to be a little bit more clear about what we're talking about, because I want us to understand that this notion of Afrofuturism has a historical specificity as being a concept to explain or to be a platform or an area or a scope or a lens through which to understand an ancient people. And so for me, I tend to I like the concept of an ancient future as being the foundation that has a longer trajectory or a longer genealogy an ancient African past. And the reason why I say that is because if we're thinking about an Afrofuturism as an intellectual or theoretical frame or a lens through which to understand the place of Africa in the future, we have to understand that the future or time or temporality is something that Africans in the ancient context have always understood and always understood at a deep level through cultural expression, material expression, but also through the spiritual practices and also the philosophical understandings and also the idea of language and the idea, the use of the invocation of different types of undercurrents or underthoughts of words or ideas. And so to understand this particular argument that I'm making is that an Afrofuturism is actually has a genesis in an ancient African past, is that we must understand and examine it as first an idea, and also secondly as a material or cultural expression. And what we're alluding to here is that to understand, this concept of an Afrofuturism as being a continuum that is a lens through which we can examine and map this very ancient idea to an African future. And I'm thinking about this in the same way that we think about Pan-Africanism. And so to study Pan-Africanism, we have to study it as in two ways. We have to study it first, obviously, as an idea, but also in ways that it attempts to institutionalize itself or to recognize itself. And so we study Pan-Africanism with a little p as being the idea, the sentiment, the expression, the philosophical, the unconscious, or the non-dominant ways that Africans express themselves throughout time and space, but also the attempts of Africans to institutionalize that through, obviously, the congresses, but also in many other variations and expressions through seeking freedom, or the ideas of seeking freedom, or the ideas of establishing, the notion of freedom and justice. And so a place that we can see Afrofuturism coming together in both idea and an institutional or material expression, I argue, is that its most vibrant is through maroon communities. And so this very ancient idea, as we're mapping through time and space, is that we see the impulse of Africans to envision and recreate, I shouldn't say recreate, but to create a new way of understanding or a new way of being, despite the conditions within which they're forced, despite the conditions within which they find themselves. So I think that it is important for us to highlight the central premise of African or Afrofutures, that there must be a contradiction that must be contended with, the dialectic between the racist notions of Africa as being primitive and also the notion of a future projection, or the projection of an Africa into the future. So in order to really understand what we're talking about, this intellectual, theoretical frame or lens that we are associating with, or we're dealing with today as being an Afrofuturism / African future, and you're going to hear me say this throughout our engagement tonight, is because I want us to understand a lot of times Afrofuturism is arrested in a certain particular frame of reference or a disciplinary understanding. And so what people have been doing, a lot of people who have been dealing with this concept, including myself, is kind of really moving it outside of the tendencies to deal with it in a very limited way, just based upon science fiction or speculative fiction, as we allude to or point to. But we generally have to understand it, as I'm arguing, as a very ancient idea that has multiple expressions. And we're going to talk about those expressions. One of those expressions I just showed you, I just talked about, I just said, was maroon communities. But we have an ancient idea of an expression of an African future with the Sankofa bird and the Adikra symbols. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute, to understand that Africans, and my argument here is that Africans or Afrofuturism or an African future is a very ancient idea, even though we generally give a credit to Mark Deary in the 1990s, who is a cultural critic, who was the one who coined the term Afrofuturism. Again, I am the type of person who really thinks that it's important for us to not really pin down or limit the origins of things to one particular era, one particular point, because then we miss a lot of the evolutions and a lot of the contributions of the different variations of the different ideas and the different ways that people have been expressing in Afrofuturism or African future. But generally, in an academic term, and we'll deal with it academically now, is that Mark Deary, a cultural critic, coined the term Afrofuturism in a essay that he was writing called Black to the Future. And in this essay, he generally posed a particular question that I think that most of us have dealt with on some level, in some way, no matter what age you are, particularly if you're looking at the different productions or the different ideas that have expressed themselves through movies, through literature. And being a cultural critic, that generally is when folk kind of, dealing with that aesthetic part. That's the reason why aesthetic, or the material expression of Afrofuturism, tends to have a more weight on than its philosophical or its historical or ancestral genealogy. But that's the argument that I'm making tonight. And that is what I'm putting forth tonight, along with the aesthetic or the material expression of an Afrofuturism. We also have to include, those deeper frameworks in order to map it in its longer tradition or in its ancient tradition. So if we are to do this within basically tracing this ancient idea, we have to obviously, as I said a few minutes ago, is to really understand that there's a dialectic here. There's a dialectic centered on the racist notions of Africa as being primitive, yet and still the understanding that Africa is the future within the past, but also as we're moving forward. Why do I say that? Of course, all of the technology, all of the material expressions of a future, if we're looking at it in a very, very limited sense of its aesthetic or its materiality, such as cars, such as phones and access to information and the use of airplanes and those types of things, is that, interestingly enough, of course, most of the natural resources that allow those things to be considered to be futuristic come from the continent of Africa itself. Now, those things have always been there as well in Africa, along with the people itself. So as we muck through this process of the interdependent complexities, in order to leave here with some sense of the breadth and depth of what is essentially Africa and the time concept that we are associating with an Afrofuturism, but moving it beyond its arrested, limited understanding of time from a European conceptualization, is important that we understand it through a series of ways, right? One of those particular ways, or one of those themes, is literature, or word. Another theme is thought, and another theme is expression. Why is it important to do this? As I'm arguing, is that we have a very clear understanding of Afrofuturism being expressed or being understood in literature and word. And we also have a particularly fairly good understanding of the expression of Afrofuturism as being expressed through cultural production. Our culture is a platform for the material expression of the freedom principle. And so, but what we don't have in the conversation too much is the thought or the principle of the freedom principle of thought that is captured in this notion of an Afrofuturism. But let's deal with Afrofuturism, and we muck through it, and we're going to take it apart to understand its ancient roots.
I don't know, I feel like maybe the thought behind it kind of manifests itself within the material, I feel like.
Mm-hmm. Of course.
Because for instance, like me, myself, like the way that I approach like rap or like even like basic cover art, I'm using like various elements from like, I don't know.
And that I don't know is what I'm actually talking about. So because we have its expression and we have a clear, like I said, we have a pretty good understanding of Afrofuturism as being a concept that is expressed through, obviously, word, right? Literature. I'm even going to expand that particular notion in a minute, of us even moving it through word and the concept of something that is an expression that has a deep, deep meaning, okay? And I think, and so the material expression, but that I don't know that you just said is exactly where I am arguing that that is where you have to look at ontology, epistemology, those particular frames of understanding to put together. Oh, it's the glue. So right now it's an orbit. You're absolutely right. You use, your words, and then you attach material to it. But however, what is it that pushes you through? What is it the thought processes, and what is it that you're using to even take you there? And what I'm arguing is that that is a more ancient tradition. And that what we're really talking about here is one particular thread or one particular instance of an idea of a future that Africans expressed in ancient terms that was beyond just the moment or just that particular, let me just express myself in this particular instance because this is the way that I feel. The way that I feel has to move over time and space, and we have to unexplain what that is. Tayoka, you had something?
Oh, because I was going to ask you, what did you mean by freedom principle of thought?
We're about to get to, okay? In order for us to really understand this concept, and again, because my argument here is that we first have to understand this notion of an African future or an Afrofuturism as being an ancient idea, because again, it was coined, in a particular period of time. And it was coined in a particular period of time in a particular discipline and a particular way that people were a cultural critic who was examining the cultural production, first of all, that was born of a European concept. That's the reason why I said the contradictions are important. The idea that Africa has no history, that is primitive, yet and still is producing every particular idea that we have known, even the idea of a space, even the idea of a reality beyond reality, even the idea, as I mentioned to you guys earlier, in quantum physics or in molecular biology, is that Africans had a principle that was expressed particularly when we talk about the notion of the atom, the notion of Amun, right? The hidden, which that's an idea, but how does it express itself? How do you wrap something around that particular principle that can carry over through time and space? That becomes important, okay? All right, so in order for us to be able to really understand this, we really have to understand that Afrofuturism or an African future has these components. In order to understand it, we have to understand it as word. We have to understand it as an idea, but also as an expression. Let's deal with this. The category of word or literature or written has two trains of thought running through it, but they are connected if you go down both paths, right? So what that means is that this particular thread of an African futurism or an Afrofuture through word and literature means that there is an expression of an African humanity as an active agent of one's life and lived experiences in order to be free, right? So what do I mean by that? If you're looking at the notion of everything that is written in the construct or in the category of an Afrofuturism or an African future, whether it's literature or whether it's through word, it always has an expression of freedom. There's a freedom component, a freedom principle that is always underlining, that is attached to this idea of a future. The idea of a future always has a freedom principle that is ingrained or that is wrapped into it. This idea of I am moving from this particular place and these particular conditions to another place and to other conditions that also contribute to my particular freedom. If I get to that particular place and those particular conditions are impinging upon my freedom, I need to move to another place within which this future moment also has a freedom principle that is always attached to it. So that's what I mean by the freedom principle, is that when we're thinking about this concept of an African future or an Afrofuturism, is that the principle that runs through it, that connects all of these particular categories when we're trying to really assess and understand Afrofuturism or an African future as a theoretical frame of reference, we have to understand again that there's a freedom principle there. Okay, so what do I mean here? So the writers that are associated with this particular thread, they express this through various ways, but this idea of this freedom principle, and in order for us to understand Afrofuturism as an ancient concept and how it debunks and unpacks the notion of time, we also have to clearly understand what John Henrik Clarke's definition of history, which is appropriate for us to understand what I mean here. And of course, history is not everything he says, but it's the starting point. History is the clock that people use to tell their political and cultural time of day. It is the compass they use to find themselves on the map of human geography. It tells them where they are, but more importantly, where they must be. With this concept of history as articulated by John Henrik Clarke, really is an African, it really has this idea of a future in it, meaning that history is also a future. History is simultaneously an understanding of the conditions of what is considered to be a past, but also within it, there's this kernel, this freedom principle, the egg, that is something that hatches itself as we move forward. Why is this important? We understand this because if you see the material expression through an ancient idea, we can see it through the Sankofa bird. How do we know this? How do we know that the Sankofa bird can be an African or an Afrofuturistic representation of an idea of an Afrofuturism, African future? Let's look at it. So the bird itself, of course, body is moving forward, it's looking forward, and then it's the head is looking towards the back, and in it, it has the egg, but the body, of course, is moving forward. And of course, you have the body of the bird. We also know this principle, the principle of gender is there, but it's also not as clearly identified until you look closely. But also, what is that egg? That egg is the idea of the freedom principle. So the material expression of an Afrofuturism can be articulated in John Henrik Clarke's definition of what history is, or how we should understand history, but it also is the material expression that we find in a lot of the writers that are thinking about, the idea of a future, the idea of an African future that is that is not arrested by these racist notions of time that encapsulates an African people and wed them to those particular conditions, i.e. slavery as being the articulation of the full history of Africans, i.e. civil rights as being the full articulation of a Black freedom, right? i.e. Barack Obama. We can go on and on and on. So what I'm saying is that this notion of an African future, an Afrofuturism, is an idea that is written into the genealogy of an African time, but it's also something...
Due to time constraint, you can listen to the entire program on Africa World Now Project's SoundCloud. Just search Africa World Now Project.
Back at it again.